The Vorkai Dominance did not consider itself cruel. That distinction mattered to them. They had philosophers who had written extensively on the subject. Cruelty implied emotion, implied that harm was inflicted for the satisfaction of inflicting it. The Vorkai did not operate on satisfaction. They operated on calculus. Every action they took against another civilization was the output of a rational equation, where variables like resource access, territorial buffer zones, and political signal value were weighed against costs and timelines and acceptable loss ratios. When the Vorkai harmed someone, it was because the math said to. That was not cruelty, that was policy. They had built an interstellar empire on that policy. 31 systems under direct Vorkai administration, 14 more under tributary arrangements, civilizations that paid in resources and labor and political deference because the math had made clear to them that resistance was more expensive than compliance. The dominance stretched across a volume of space that would have taken a human ship 6 weeks to cross at continuous jump, and it had taken them 3 centuries to build it. 3 centuries of calculus, 3 centuries of equations that always resolved the same way. Vorkai expansion was worth the cost, resistance to that expansion was not. They had never been wrongs. The Vorkai Intelligence Directorate had been monitoring humanity for 11 years before the Convoy Incident. 11 years of passive observation, signal analysis, strategic assessment. They had reviewed the Sol engagement of 2387. They had reviewed the Meridian Point operation of 2401. They had built a comprehensive threat profile and had concluded correctly by any reasonable measure that direct military confrontation with humanity was inadvisable. The Sol engagement had demonstrated a weapons technology gap that the Vorkai could not bridge in the near term. Meridian Point had demonstrated an intelligence and operational planning capability that made conventional leverage strategies unreliable. The Directorate's conclusion was that humanity should be left alone. For now, the caveat was important. The Directorate was not recommending permanent avoidance, they were recommending patience. The current human military posture was formidable, but it was also expensive. Sustaining the project threshold infrastructure, the drone carriers, the deep system platforms, the global defense network, consumed resources at a rate that the Directorate's economists projected would create political pressure within 2 to 3 decades. Defense spending at that level was politically sustainable in the immediate aftermath of the Sol engagement. In 20 years, with no further conflict, the pressure to reallocate those resources would grow. Patience was the strategy. Wait for the spending to become politically untenable. Wait for the defense infrastructure to be quietly reduced. Wait for humanity to decide that the threat had passed and that the cost of maintaining readiness was higher than the risk of reducing it. Then recalculate. It was a sound strategy. The Directorate had presented it to the Vorkai High Council with full supporting analysis, and the High Council had approved it unanimously. Then the Frontier Commerce Division had made a different calculation. The Frontier Commerce Division was not the military directorate. It was not the intelligence arm. It was the administrative body responsible for managing the Vorkai Dominance's economic interests in the outer systems. The buffer zones, the transit corridors, the resource extraction operations that funded the expansion program. It was staffed by administrators and economists, not strategists, and it had a mandate that was defined in terms of quarterly resource targets and transit efficiency metrics. The division had identified a problem. Human commercial convoys operating in the Vila Transit Corridor, a region that crossed the outer edge of what the Vorkai considered their informal sphere of influence, were disrupting the Dominance's logistics network, not aggressively, not intentionally, simply by existing, by operating on routes that crossed or paralleled Vorkai transit lanes, by creating navigational complexity in a region that the division had assumed was effectively Vorkai-controlled. The division's solution was characteristically administrative. Disrupt the human convoys. Not destroy them, the military directorate had been explicit about the risks of direct conflict. Disrupt them. Seize cargo, damage drives, make the routes economically non-viable. Force human commercial traffic out of the corridor through a series of incidents that could be individually attributed to navigation hazards, equipment failure, and miscommunication. Death by 1,000 administrative decisions. The division submitted the plan to the High Council as a logistics optimization measure. The High Council approved it without consulting the military. Why directorate? The first incident occurred on October 3, 2412. A Vorkai enforcement vessel intercepted a human commercial convoy of 9 ships in the outer Vila corridor. The convoy was carrying manufacturing equipment, medical supplies, and approximately 300 civilian personnel to a research colony on the far side of the expanse. The Vorkai vessel declared the convoy to be in violation of a transit ordinance that the Vorkai Dominance had issued 4 months earlier and had transmitted to United Earth Assembly offices, where it had been received, reviewed, and formally rejected. The Vorkai enforcement vessel seized 2 of the 9 ships. The crew and passengers of those ships, 111 people, were transferred to a Vorkai administrative holding facility. The remaining 7 ships were released and ordered to return to human space. The Vorkai enforcement vessel transmitted a report to the Frontier Commerce Division. The division logged it as a successful logistics optimization action. At no point did anyone in the division calculate what would happen next. The report reached the United Earth Defense Command at 14:33 hours, Sol Standard Time on October 3, 2412. It came through a relay chain. The 7 released ships had transmitted the incident report the moment they cleared the engagement zone, and the signal had propagated through human deep space relay networks at light speed, arriving at UEDC Command Headquarters at Fleet Admiral Dara Solis' console while she was in a routine morning briefing with her senior staff. The briefing stopped. Solis read the report once. She did not read it twice. She did not need to. Confirm the coordinates of the incident, she said. Her operations officer confirmed them. Outer Vila corridor, grid reference 77 Alpha, 48 light-years from the nearest human military installation, 62 light-years from Earth. Confirm the identity of the vessel, she said. Vorkai Dominance Enforcement Cruiser. Registry matches the VDS exactitude. Frontier Commerce Division asset. Confirm the number of personnel in Vorkai custody. 111. Mix of civilian crew and passengers. Medical staff, engineers, 3 families. The holding facility is consistent with Vorkai administrative detention. Designation is Waystation Keth-Four in the outer dominance buffer zone. Solis looked at her senior staff. They looked back at her. Every person in that room had read the UEDC doctrine updates. Every person in that room knew what the doctrine said. They had trained to it, had planned around it, had built operational scenarios that assumed it would eventually be tested. It was being tested. Get me the Secretary of Defense, Solis said, and the Assembly Emergency Council. I need both channels open in 4 minutes. She stood up while her communications team worked. She walked to the strategic display at the center of the room, a 3-dimensional map of human-controlled space and its surrounding regions, updated in real time from relay data. The Vila corridor glowed on the display. Waystation Keth-Four was 49 light-years from the incident site and 71 light-years from Earth. She looked at it the way a surgeon looked at a problem before operating. Not with emotion, with precision. The channels opened. The Secretary of Defense appeared on the primary screen. The Assembly Emergency Council filled the secondary display, 12 faces, in the emergency session configuration that existed specifically for decisions that could not wait for full parliamentary procedure. Solis presented the situation in 90 seconds. She did not editorialize, she did not recommend. She presented facts: location, personnel count, Vorkai vessel identity, holding facility designation, status of the released convoy. Then she said, "The UEDC doctrine on detained personnel is clear. I am requesting authorization to execute recovery operations under Operation Homebound protocols." Well, the Secretary of Defense said, "You have it." The Assembly Emergency Council voted, 31 seconds, unanimous. Solis looked at the clock. From the moment the report arrived at her console to the moment she had authorization, 51 minutes. "Operations," she said, "execute Pathway 7. Pathway 7 was not a plan that had been written in response to the Vorkai incident. It was a plan that had been written in 2403, 1 year after Meridian Point, as part of a comprehensive operational planning cycle that covered 37 distinct threat scenarios across every major power in humanity's strategic neighborhood. It covered the specific scenario of a Vorkai Dominance enforcement action against civilian assets in the Vila corridor to a level of detail that suggested its authors had either predicted the Vorkai Frontier Commerce Division's logistics optimization plan with uncanny accuracy, or had known something the division did not. They had known something the division did not. Specifically, they had been monitoring the division's transit ordnance development for 8 months, had assessed the ordnance as a precursor to enforcement action, and had drafted Pathway 7 in the expectation that enforcement would come. The fleet had begun prepositioning 9 days ago. Fleet status, Solis said. Strike Group 7 is at Waypoint 4, 38 light-years from Waystation Keth-Four. Transit time to objective, 14 hours at optimized jump profile. A special recovery is positioned. 12 operators confirmed inside Waystation Keth-Four. They rotated in 6 days ago on a maintenance contract through a subsidiary of Vila Transit Solutions. All personnel accounted for, transmitters placed, detention facility mapped. Solis nodded. "Tell Strike Group 7 to move," she said. "Tell Recovery to stand by for activation signal, and open a channel to the Vorkai High Council." Her communications officer looked up, now Admiral. "Now," she said, "before they know the fleet is moving." The Vorkai High Council was not in emergency session when the human communication arrived. They were in a routine administrative meeting, reviewing quarterly resource reports from the outer systems. The communication request from the United Earth Defense Command arrived as an interruption, unexpected, flagged as urgent by the relay system, displaying the authentication signature of a senior human military official. The Council convened on the communication channel within 8 minutes. Fleet Admiral Solis was on the screen. She was at her command console. She looked like someone who had been awake for several hours and intended to be awake for several more, and whose alertness was of the kind that had nothing to do with rest. "High Council," she said. "I am Fleet Admiral Dara Solis, United Earth Defense Command. I will be brief. At 14:33 hours Sol Standard Time, your Frontier Commerce Division seized 2 vessels from a human commercial convoy in the Vila corridor and detained 111 civilians. This action was unauthorized under any recognized interstellar transit law and constitutes an act of aggression against human civilian personnel and property." The council chamber was quiet. "I am notifying you of the following," she continued. The United Earth Assembly has authorized a military recovery operation for our detained personnel. That operation is currently underway. I expect it to be complete within 16 hours. Our personnel will be returned to us. One of the council members spoke. High Counselor Merv, the senior diplomatic authority, a measured voice accustomed to managing the space between crisis and resolution. Admiral Solis, we understand your concern. This appears to have been an administrative action by our Commerce Division that was not coordinated with military or diplomatic channels. We are prepared to discuss the situation and arrange for the release of. I'm not discussing the release, Solis said. I told you the recovery operation is underway. Your release or non-release of our people is no longer the variable that matters. A pause. Then what is the variable that matters? Merv asked. What happens after, Solis said. Another pause. The United Earth Assembly has voted to classify this action as an act of war, she said. That classification carries specific doctrinal consequences under our military authority. I want to be precise with you because precision matters here. An act of war does not automatically mean we are at war. It means we have the standing to respond as if we are, for as long as the causative action remains unaddressed. She let that settle. 111 people, she said. That is the causative action. When those 111 people are recovered and back in human space, the causative action is partially addressed, but not fully. Merv's voice was careful. What constitutes full resolution? Acknowledgement, Solis said, public formal transmitted on open channels to every relay in your network. The Vorkai Dominance acknowledges that the seizure was illegal, that it constituted an act of aggression, and that it will not be repeated. Additionally, the Frontier Commerce Division's Transit Ordinance, which has no legal basis under any recognized framework, is formally rescinded. And if we do not provide those acknowledgements, Merv asked. Solis looked at him directly. Then the act of war remains unaddressed, she said, and the UEDC will continue to operate under war authority in the regions adjacent to Vorkai space until it is resolved. I want you to understand specifically what that means. It means our military assets in your neighborhood operate under wartime rules of engagement. It means every Vorkai enforcement vessel, every commercial asset, every administrative installation within our operational range is a legitimate military target for as long as the classification stands. The Council Chamber W. As very quiet. I am not threatening you, Solis said. I am describing the doctrine. The doctrine exists because of this situation exactly. Because someone made an administrative decision that affected 111 human lives, and we need the cost of that decision to be legible, clearly, precisely, permanently legible to everyone who might consider making a similar decision in the future. She paused. You have 16 hours, she said. Use them to think. She closed the channel. In 2402, the year after Meridian Point, the United Earth Defense Command had conducted an internal strategic review. The review was classified at the highest level. Its findings were never released publicly, but its conclusions had shaped every operational plan, every doctrinal update, every strategic posture decision that the UEDC had made in the decades since. The review had asked one question: what is the long-term strategic cost of the precedent established by the Sol engagement and Meridian Point? The answer had been uncomfortable. Both engagements had demonstrated conclusively that humanity could defend itself against the military and leverage strategies of its neighbors. But both had also established something that the review's authors considered a vulnerability. They had established that humanity responded, that humanity was reactive at the level of triggering events, that a probe had to enter the system before Project Threshold activated, that hostages had to be taken before Operation Homebound deployed. Reactive was better than unprepared. But reactive was not the same as decisive. The difference mattered, the review argued, because of what it communicated to potential adversaries. A reactive power communicated, attack us directly and you will lose. A decisive power communicated something different. Something stronger. The review's primary recommendation was the development of what it called a total response doctrine, a clearly articulated, publicly registered, strategically unambiguous framework that specified in advance exactly what categories of action against human personnel and interests would trigger exactly what levels of military response, with no negotiation window, no ambiguity period, and no variable dependent on political deliberation at the time of the event. The doctrine would be communicated to every major power in humanity's strategic neighborhood. It would be registered with every interstellar diplomatic framework in which humanity participated. It would be, in the language the review used, pre-committed, meaning that the response to a triggering event would not require a decision, because the decision had already been made institutionally, irrevocably, before the triggering event occurred. Pre-commitment removed the negotiation window. And removing the negotiation window removed the strategic value of the triggering event itself. If an adversary seized human civilians and the response was guaranteed, not probable, not likely, but guaranteed, then the seizure produced no leverage. It produced only cost. The adversary got nothing from the action except the certainty of a response they did not want. The calculus collapsed. The review had taken 18 months to develop the full doctrine framework. It had been stress-tested against 63 adversary scenarios, including one that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to a Vorkai Frontier Commerce Division enforcement action in the Vila Corridor. The doctrine had been registered with the Interstellar Diplomatic Framework in 2406. The Vorkai Dominance had received a copy. Their diplomatic archives had logged it, catalogued it, and filed it. Their Frontier Commerce Division had not read it. This was the fact that Fleet Admiral Solis thought about most, in the quiet moments between the channel to the High Council closing and the strike group reaching its final waypoint. Not the military situation that was managed, planned, proceeding on schedule. She thought about the administrative failure that had produced this crisis. 111 people in a holding facility, because a logistics division had approved a plan without reading a diplomatic filing that was sitting in their own government's archives. The doctrine existed to make that kind of failure expensive enough that it would not be repeated. Expensive enough and visible enough and legible enough to everyone watching. Because everyone was always watching. The 47 civilizations the Verk had consumed were watching. The Keth were watching. Every species that had a relay in range and a reason to care about what humanity did and how humanity did it was watching. Every species that had ever been leveraged or threatened or had a convoy seized by a logistics division that had decided the math worked in its favor. They were all watching. And the doctrine was not only for the Vorkai. Strike Group 7 arrived at the outer perimeter of Waystation Keth-Four at 4:47 hours. Sol Standard Time, October 4th, 2412. The station was a Vorkai administrative installation, not military, not hardened, built for transit processing and commercial logistics management. Its defensive complement was 6 patrol vessels and a fixed-gun array designed to deter opportunistic piracy in the outer buffer zone. It had not been designed to deter 200 warships. Nobody had designed anything to deter 200 warships except humanity. Admiral Chen Wei, commanding Strike Group 7 from the bridge of the UES Inexorable, reviewed the final approach data and activated the internal channel to his special recovery team. Recovery, this is Strike Group 7 actual. We are at perimeter, confirm status. The response came from inside Waystation Keth-Four, where 12 UEDC operators had been in position for 6 days. Strike Group 7 recovery confirms. Detention facility located on Level 4, Section C through F 111 personnel accounted for, all alive. Guards present 42. Shift rotation occurs in 11 minutes. We recommend activation at rotation minus 90 seconds. Confirmed, Chen said. We will begin our approach at rotation minus 2 minutes. Prepare for signal. He looked at his tactical display. The station's 6 patrol vessels were holding position at standard alert, not combat stations, which told him the station's commander had not yet processed the strategic situation. 48 light-years from the incident site, Waystation Keth-Four's commander would have received some communications from the division, but the speed of the developing situation had likely left him with incomplete information and no clear orders. That was useful. Uncertain commanders gave their subordinates uncertain orders. Open a channel to the station, Chen said. The station's duty officer appeared on screen. Young, mid-rank, the expression of someone who had just been handed a situation that was substantially above his clearance to manage. This is Admiral Chen Wei, United Earth Defense Command, commanding Strike Group 7. I am transmitting under war authority as declared by the United Earth Assembly at 15:24 hours Seoul Standard Time yesterday. You are holding 111 human civilians in your Level 4 detention facility. I am here to recover them. I request that you stand down your patrol vessels, open your shuttle approach corridor, and prepare your Level 4 sections for evacuation. The duty officer blinked. I need to contact my command authority. Your command authority is the High Council, Chen said. They are currently in communication with Fleet Admiral Solis. While you are trying to reach them, I am going to begin my approach. I recommend you use the time to ensure your personnel in Level 4 stand down. My recovery team will be moving in approximately 9 minutes. I would prefer they encounter no resistance. So would your personnel. He closed the channel. Recovery, send the activation signal, he said. The micro-transmitters inside the station responded. In Level 4, the environmental control panels sent a pulse through the bulkhead systems. Blast doors, the emergency pressure containment systems, designed to seal sections in the event of hull breach, dropped across every corridor leading into sections C through F. The detention zone was sealed. 42 guards on rotation suddenly found themselves outside the sealed zone. 12 UEDC operators inside the zone. 111 civilians inside the zone. The operators moved with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact scenario approximately 200 times in training facilities built to the dimensions of Waystation Keth-Four's Level 4 sections, using floor plans derived from the maintenance surveys conducted during 6 days of access rotations. They moved fast, they moved quietly. They moved to every point in the detention layout that the floor plans had identified as a control node, a lock mechanism, a camera array. Inside 7 minutes, every cell in sections C through F was open. The civilians were not panicking. The ones who were aware, the senior crew members, the people with enough experience to read a situation, had recognized the operator's equipment and insignia and had understood. They had begun organizing the others, guiding the families, keeping the children calm. 111 people moving through a sealed corridor toward a shuttle bay access point. The operators covered the movement, 2 at the front, 6 in rotation along the corridor, 4 at the rear. The station's patrol vessels had not moved. Uncertain commanders, uncertain orders. Chen watched the approach corridor on his display. His shuttle teams were already moving, 6 craft, running at the velocities that UEDC pilots trained at specifically for recovery operations, where the difference between a clean extraction and a complicated one was often measured in seconds. So the first shuttle docked at the external bay access 8 minutes after the activation signal. The last human civilian was aboard a shuttle 12 minutes after that. 20 minutes total from activation to extraction. 111 people. Zero casualties. The shuttles cleared the station perimeter, and the strike group's point defense net folded around them automatically. A bubble of overlapping coverage that made the shuttle formation effectively untouchable for anything the station's 6 patrol vessels could generate. Chen opened the station channel again. The duty officer was still at his console. He had the look of someone who had watched something happen very quickly and was still processing the speed of it. "Your detention facility is empty," Chen said. "Our personnel are aboard our vessels. Your station and your personnel are unharmed. I am withdrawing Strike Group 7. He paused. "Tell your commander to tell his superiors this is what we do, every time, without exception, without negotiation, without delay." He closed the channel. "Strike Group 7, this is Admiral Chen. All personnel recovered. All shuttles aboard. Prepare jump calculations for Sol Standard Waypoint 7. He looked at the tactical display one more time. The station, the 6 patrol vessels that had never moved, the empty shuttle corridor. "Take us home," he said. The Vorkai High Council received confirmation of the Waystation Keth-Four recovery operation at 8:31 hours. The confirmation came from the station's duty officer, who had filed a complete incident report with the kind of compulsive thoroughness that people under extreme stress sometimes defaulted to. The report was detailed. It covered the fleet arrival, the channel communication from Admiral Chen, the activation event in Level 4, the extraction timeline, the departure. 20 minutes, 111 people. Zero resistance possible. The Council had been in continuous session since Fleet Admiral Solis' communication the previous day. They had in that time received 3 communications from the UEDC monitoring the situation's development, each one consistent in tone and content with the first. They had received extensive analysis from the Military Directorate, which had been very quiet about having told them not to let the Frontier Commerce Division operate in the Vila corridor. The Directorate's after-action brief was precise. It covered the fleet prepositioning timeline 9 days before the incident, consistent with UEDC intelligence penetration of the division's operational planning. It covered the operator insertion 6 days before the incident, consistent with a systematic program of preemptive access into potential detention facilities. It covered the 20-minute extraction against a station with 42 guards and 6 patrol vessels. And it covered the doctrinal framework that Solis had referenced in her communication, which the Directorate had retrieved from the diplomatic archive where it had been sitting since 2406. The brief concluded with a section that the Directorate had clearly written with some difficulty. It was the section that explained to the Council what the military had known, what the diplomatic archives contained, and what the Frontier Commerce Division had done without reading either. High Counselor Merv read the brief twice. Well, he set it down. "The humans registered this doctrine 6 years ago," he said. "They did," the Directorate Chief confirmed. "It specifies exactly this scenario: seizure of civilian personnel, immediate war authority classification, military recovery operation, zero negotiation." "Oh, it does." And the division approved the enforcement action without consulting this document. Silence. The division's mandate does not include diplomatic archive review as part of the operational approval process, the Directorate Chief said carefully. Zmerv looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the rest of the Council. "The humans have not fired a shot," he said. They seized nothing of ours, they destroyed nothing of ours, they came, they took their people back, and they told us what happens next is our choice. He folded his hands on the table. And they are right that it is our choice, it is entirely our choice. The room was quiet. The act of war classification remains active, he said. Fleet Admiral Solis was explicit. It remains active until the acknowledgement and the rescission of the transit ordinance. Until then, their military assets in our neighborhood operate under wartime rules of engagement. He paused. How many Vorkai commercial assets are currently within their operational range? The logistics officer checked. 43 commercial vessels, 11 administrative installations, 3 transit stations. 43 ships, 11 installations, 3 stations. All of them under the UEDC's declared war authority, legitimate targets for as long as the classification stood. Well, yeah, humans had not targeted any of them. They had not threatened any of them. They had simply left the math on the table, stated clearly and without embellishment, and let the council do what councils did. Merv thought about leverage, about how the Keth had tried it, about how the architecture of leverage assumed that the target civilization would engage with the logic of the situation, would weigh compliance against refusal and find compliance cheaper. The humans had abolished that logic entirely. They had pre-committed, institutionally, irrevocably, publicly. The decision about how to respond to a seizure of their people had been made in 2402, filed in 2406, and executed in 2412 without a moment of hesitation or deliberation. There was no leverage to apply because there was no decision left to influence. Draft the acknowledgement, Merv said. Full text, open channel every relay in our network, and rescind the ordinance formally, immediately. He looked around the table. And then we are going to have a very long conversation about the Frontier Commerce Division's operational approval process. The vote took 40 seconds. Unanimous. The Vorkai acknowledgement was transmitted on open channels at 13:44 hours Sol Standard Time, October 4th, 2412. It was comprehensive. It acknowledged the seizure. It acknowledged the legal status of the action as a violation of recognized interstellar transit protocols. It acknowledged that the Vorkai Dominance's Frontier Commerce Division had acted without proper authorization or diplomatic consultation. It rescinded the transit ordinance in full. It expressed the High Council's commitment to ensuring that civilian personnel of all civilizations operating in transit corridors under recognized international frameworks would not be subject to enforcement actions by dominance administrative bodies. It was, in the diplomatic community's assessment, one of the most complete and unambiguous acknowledgments that any major interstellar power had ever issued to another. The UEDC received it, verified it, and updated the Act of War classification to resolved. The process from incident to resolution had taken 31 hours. 111 people had been seized. 111 people had been recovered. The total number of weapons fired by human military forces, 0. The total number of Vorkai personnel harmed by human military forces, 0. Fleet Admiral Solis filed the after-action report and attended a briefing with the UEDC's Strategic Planning Division to review lessons learned. The briefing covered 3 main topics: intelligence penetration, timeline validation, prepositioning efficiency, and the doctrinal communication effectiveness analysis. The third topic took the longest. The question the Planning Division was trying to answer was, had the total response doctrine communicated effectively? Had the Vorkai High Council understood, from the doctrine and from the events, what the doctrine meant and why it existed? The preliminary assessment was, yes, with caveats. The council understood. The military directorate had clearly understood for some time. The failure had been in the division, a body operating under a separate mandate that had not integrated the doctrinal framework into its decision process. The caveats were about institutional depth. A doctrine that was understood at the high council level, but not at the operational planning level, was a doctrine that would be tested again by the wrong people making decisions without enough information. The planning division's recommendation was continued communication, not threats, not demonstrations, but persistent, clear, multilateral transmission of the doctrinal framework through every diplomatic and intelligence channel available. Make it impossible for any operational body of any potential adversary to claim ignorance of what the response to an action against human personnel would be. Make it a fact of the strategic environment, as settled and legible as the positions of stars. Solis approved the recommendation. She thought briefly about the Frontier Commerce Division administrator who had signed the enforcement action approval. A logistics professional doing logistics math, working toward a quarterly resource target, making a decision about transit efficiency that had activated a military response framework spanning 60 light-years and involving 200 warships. The administrator had not known what they were doing. That was the most dangerous kind of mistake, not malice, not strategy. An administrative decision made in isolation without access to the full picture of what that decision would cost. The total response doctrine existed precisely for that administrator, not to punish them, to reach them before they signed the document, to make the doctrinal consequence legible enough at every level of every potential adversary's organizational structure that the person doing the logistics math woo. LD know would have to know, because it was registered and distributed and impossible to miss, that this particular calculation had a consequence they were not accounting for. 111 peoples, 200 warships, 31 hours, 0 shots fired. And make the math clear enough, and the math itself was the deterrent. The transmission record of the Vorkai acknowledgement was archived in the UEDC's Strategic Intelligence Library, alongside every other interaction in what analysts were beginning to call, in internal documents, the deterrence record. A growing body of strategic data demonstrating the cumulative effect of humanity's pre-commitment doctrine on the behavior of potential adversaries. The Sol engagement Meridian Point, Waystation Keth-Four. Each one different in its specifics, each one consistent in its outcome. Each one adding to a picture that was becoming, in the strategic consciousness of every civilization with a relay in range, a kind of axiom. You did not move against humanity's people. Not because you could not technically, physically, the act itself was possible, as 3 different civilizations had demonstrated. You did not move against them because the response was guaranteed, documented, pre-committed, and immune to the leverage dynamics that made such actions strategic in the first place. You did not move against humanity because humanity had decided, institutionally and irrevocably, that the cost of establishing that precedent was acceptable, and had spent 25 years building the capacity to pay that cost every single time. In a labor facility on a world the Werk called Extraction Unit 12, someone had a radio receiver. It was small, handmade, built over months from components salvaged from the facility's maintenance waste. Nothing that a processing cohort would be expected to have, nothing that would be recognized as what it was by a guard doing a routine inspection, because it looked like nothing at all. It picked up long-range relay transmissions, fragments, partial signals, the kind of data that traveled across interstellar distances and arrived degraded and incomplete and requiring reconstruction. The person who had built it had spent 2 years reconstructing fragments. They had a picture now, not complete, not clear, but a picture. A species in one system with 11 billion people and a doctrine registered 6 years before the first test. A fleet that moved at speeds that made the math wrong for anyone who tried to apply conventional strategic logic. Operators inside facilities before anyone knew the facilities would be needed. A response guaranteed before the triggering event occurred. They had a picture. They looked at it in the hours when the facility was dark and the guards were on their rotation, and the radio was as quiet as it got, which was never fully quiet but quiet enough. They thought about what it meant. Not for today, not for their immediate situation, which was what it was and which the picture could not change, not yet, not directly. For the long run. For the version of the story that played out over decades and generations, and the slow movement of facts through the galaxy's relay networks. For whatever came after. They thought about a civilization that had looked at 47 people's worth of warning and had decided to be ready before the warning arrived. That had decided the cost of readiness was always less than the cost of being caught. That had decided, and this was the part that mattered, the part that traveled farthest and arrived clearest in the degraded relay fragments, the part that needed the least reconstruction to understand. That no one would ever pay the cost of unreadiness again. Not if they could prevent it. Not if they were still standing. Not if they were still here. They put down the receiver. They looked at the ceiling of the facility, where the ventilation grate let in the thin light of a sun that was not their sun, above an atmosphere that had never been theirs, on a world that had been given a number instead of a name. They thought somewhere out there someone is planning for us too. They thought they have already started. They thought they are already here. In the Sol system, the watch continued. It always continued. The installations maintained. The drone carriers stationed. The operators rotating through assignments that had no names in any public document and no recognition in any official ceremony and no acknowledgement in any political speech, because the work they did was not the kind of work that was celebrated. It was the kind of work that prevented the things that would otherwise have to be celebrated. Admiral Solis sat at her console at 300 hours, the third night after Waystation Keth-Four, reading the Planning Division's Communication Effectiveness Report and the updated threat matrix for the next fiscal cycle and the personnel rotation requests for 12 installations she was not permit. Said to name in writings. She was tired, she was always tired. The work had a weight that did not go away with sleep because the weight was not fatigue. It was continuity. It was the understanding that the watch did not pause because she was rested or because the quarter had gone smoothly or because the Vorkai had issued their acknowledgement and the act of war classification had been resolved. The watch did not pause. The work was not done when the crisis ended. The work was done when the next crisis had already been planned for, and the one after that, and the one after that, until the planning extended far enough into the future that the gap between preparation and event was too wide for any adversary to cross before humanity was already standing at the other side, waiting. 31 hours Sol Standard. 111 people. 0 shots fired. That was the record. That was what 25 years of quiet work looked like when it was needed. That was what it meant to be always here. As she closed the report, as she opened the next one, we are still here. We are always still here.